Welcome, everyone, to a talk by Leah Stokes, Making Climate Policy Work, the Inflation Reduction Act. Also, welcome to those on Zoom. And I was asked to tell the ones on Zoom that there's a bit of a time lag. So in case Leah swears, we can kind of dub it.
We never swear, never.
There's a technical mishap, but you will get the slides a second delayed. My name is Jonas Meckling. I'm Associate Professor of Energy and Environmental Policy on campus and the faculty lead for the new climate program, the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative. And this event is brought to you by the Network for New Political Economy, run by Neil Flickstein and Steve Vogel, and the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, directed by Paul Pearson, who would have loved to be here but is traveling. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome and introduce Leah Stokes. She is a professor, the Anton Vonk Professor of Environmental Politics at UC Santa Barbara. Leah and I have known each other since grad school. I think we actually met at a party at Hannah Breed's, which we just talked about, a shared friend.
Yes.
And on a cold winter day in
Yeah,
Cambridge.
Logs, right? She made us all move wood. She was heating her home with wood, and we had to take wood up the stairs, and she paid us in pizza.
She had a fireplace in her apartment. It was a very classic experience. So since those days in grad school, it's been exhilarating for me to witness Leah's rise as a kind of powerhouse as a public intellectual and engaged scholar. So I suspect what we get to hear today is as much a scholarly account of the Inflation Reduction Act as it is an insider's perspective on from someone who is very deeply involved in US climate policy making. And among the many accolades that Leah has garnered over the last few years, some recent ones really recognize her role as a change maker. She has been nominated to the Time Next 100 list as an advocate. She's on Business Insider's top 30 global leaders on climate solutions. And in the scholarly realm, in particular, her book, Short-Circuiting Policy, has made big waves. This multiple award-winning book is a fascinating account of how electric utilities fought against clean energy laws across US states. So today we get to hear Leah's story of the Inflation Reduction Act. There will be a reception after this event where you can engage with her. If you want to hear more from Leah, tomorrow she's speaking at the Bioneers Conference on The Future is Electric. So with that, please welcome Leah to Berkeley.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, I think I have a roaming mic and a non-roaming mic, so maybe I'll use this one. Is that okay? Everybody's cool with that? Great. And hopefully it doesn't create any feedback. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. I was telling some of the grad students that I did a bunch of the research for my book here in Berkeley when I was writing about renewable portfolio standards and net metering laws, because the person who really coined that term, renewable portfolio standard, is named Nancy Rader, and she's a graduate of ERG. She wrote her master's thesis in 1992 on RPSs. Is this still working? Yes? No? Maybe? Oh, there we go. Okay. Anyway, so it's really exciting to be here. Lovely to see all of you. And I'm going to talk today about my role and experience working on federal climate policy over the last few years. Specifically what eventually became known as the Inflation Reduction Act. It was not known as that until the last 12 days of its existence. It was mostly called Build Back Better or the American Jobs Plan or other things, but that's the name it has now, so we will have to stick with that, the name that Manchin gave it. So I want to talk about sort of three steps that brought us to the Inflation Reduction Act. And it really follows classic literature and public policy by people like John Kingdon, on sort of agenda setting, alternative specification, policy enactment, that kind of a thing. So what I want to argue is that, based on my experience of working on these policies, was that basically activist groups set the agenda for climate policy by organizing nationally to push for ambitious climate policies. And they did that particularly through the Democratic presidential primaries. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in practice and why that was so important. And I think when we think about American politics, for example, we don't always think that primaries are super important in terms of policy setting. You know, there's classic work in American political science on things like the party decides, right? Which is that the nominee is a choice of the people in the party, that, you know, and that the things that the nominee says or the platforms that come up with in the primary isn't really that important for what eventually happens in the legislating time period. But what I want to show is that, at least in this case, that's not true at all, that the Democratic primary in 2018 and 2019 actually created a huge flowering of policy ideas, in part because there was like 20 people running, and also because there were all these activists putting pressure on the campaigns. The second sort of stage was alternative specification. So once climate change became the issue that was sort of top of the Democratic agenda, how did groups work together to actually say, well, what should we do about climate change? You know, what are the policies that we think we should do? And so, based on my experience working on this, a lot of what happened was there was very close coordination between advocacy groups that were working in a network, in several networks, and that they really produced very consistent, disciplined public and private messaging that climate change policy had to be enacted. It needed to meet these kinds of targets, and that we couldn't wait another decade before doing it. And then when it comes to enacting the policy, there was environmental groups and activists and experts, both inside and outside of Congress, who were using, in particular, the media to generate public pressure while privately negotiating a climate deal. And so this sort of insider-outsider dynamic, particularly using the media to keep pressure up, was very important to actually getting the bill enacted. Okay, so let's talk first about agenda setting. So you may recall that before the pandemic, there was a Democratic primary going on, and there was like 20-something people running to be the president, to be the Democratic nominee for the president, I should say. And what happened was the first plan came out from Beto O'Rourke's campaign in, I want to say, like February 2018 or something like that. And he put out this plan. It was actually surprisingly more detailed, ambitious, and interesting than people had thought. At the time, Ali Zaidi, who now serves in the White House in the climate, he's the national climate director now, you know, he was working on the Beto O'Rourke campaign, and he had worked in the Obama administration and, you know, was a climate expert. And so he helped write that campaign document for the Beto campaign. And it really quickly set off a kind of arms race where other campaigns were trying to sort of outdo one another on climate. I think it was just days after the Beto O'Rourke campaign put out their climate plan, Jay Inslee put out his first climate plan, and he ended up putting out 5 of them. And what happened was a bunch of folks, including, of course, Sunrise, started to evaluate these plans. And the media was asking questions about, well, how do we judge this plan versus that plan? What makes a plan good or not? And so here's an example of what that looks like. They sort of read through these plans and gave them scores out of 200. It's kind of a funny number, actually. They probably should have done it out of 100, but they gave them grades. And there was literally like, so classically, they gave him an F-, as you can see, Joe Biden, which is just funny. Like, why not just give an F? But it's an F-. And then they weren't the only ones doing it. There was also Greenpeace, Data for Progress, League of Conservation Voters, although that's probably more to do with their scores when they were in Congress, how they were actually voting on things. And so basically there became a way to summarize these really complex ideas down into something that was understandable, that was kind of like, is this good? Is this ambitious? Or is this not good? And myself, the first day that the Beto O'Rourke plan was published, I decided I would evaluate it, and I would go on Twitter and write a thread that explained what it was and said my thoughts on it. And I don't really know why I did that. I have no memory. And I, in fact, deleted it, which is why I can't show it to you anymore, because I did delete my tweets at some point. But it kind of went viral, and a bunch of journalists called me up and they asked me what I thought, and they asked me to explain parts of the plan. And so I started to do that every single time a climate plan came out, and journalists started to write stories every single time a climate plan came out. And then all these groups started to sort of evaluate them. And through this process, activists basically got pressure and created a kind of virtuous race to the top, where they said, you know, who's got the best climate plan? Then actually a few journalists, Brian Kahn and Emily Atkin, said that we should have a debate on climate, because what was happening is that the debates were happening And, they would go on for 2-3 hours because, like I said, there was like 20 people. It was a lot of people. And, they would have one question maybe about climate, and it would be like, so do you think the economy is more important than climate? Go. And everybody would say, that's a garbage question. How is that the only question? They do half an hour every single time on healthcare and half an hour on the economy. And then they'd ask a garbage climate question. So these climate journalists started to say, we should have a climate debate. And they actually organized one through the places that they were working at the time, but then it all fell apart. And the activists picked it up and they said, yeah, we want to have a climate debate. So groups like Sunrise were pushing for a climate debate. I was calling for it, lots of different activists and experts. And it ended up happening where there were several ones. I think one was MSNBC and the other one was CNN. And these were these events went on for like 6 hours because I remember I live tweeted them and I had to sit around and listen to people talk. But the interesting thing was that it meant that each campaign had to get their principal, the candidate, up to speed enough to be able to speak coherently about climate change on national television for more than one terribly framed question. And this, apart from educating the American people and all that, it also embedded in the actual campaigns climate change as a higher priority, because it meant that they had to be able to explain what they were doing and why it was important and be coherent about that. And all of these people, look, it is not an easy thing to run for president. I would not want to do it personally. It's really, really, really hard. Because you not only have to sacrifice your life and your privacy and travel and never sleep and everything else, but you also have to speak coherently about 20 different topics. Oh, what do you think about this war? What do you think about pharmaceutical policy? And what do you think about climate change? And what about energy and electricity? These people probably don't know a lot about all those things. Just like if you asked me to speak coherently about health policy, I would probably do a bad job. So, it's a hard bar. But if these people weren't even being asked about it, how is it going to be a priority on the campaign? How is it going to be a priority when they governed, et cetera? So this was a really big thing that was actually a combination of sort of activists as well as journalists putting pressure on the campaigns to talk about climate change. And of course, you can't talk about the primary without talking about the Inslee campaign. So people know current governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee, decided to run for president because of climate change. And he said that was the main issue that he wanted to talk about. That was why he would do it. And he had a number of staffers who had worked for him for a long time. Sam Ricketts had worked for him when he was in Congress back in the Waxman Markey days in 2008 to 2010 kind of period. And Bracken Hendricks had worked for him for decades. They'd written a book together about climate change. So he had these really seasoned staffers who knew an enormous amount about climate change. And working alongside him with the policies that they had actually implemented in Washington State, they put together these really complex plans about what they would do if they were magically, going to win the nomination. The plans, I believe, were 206 pages at the end of the day, if I'm right. And, they partially made those plans by talking to different activist groups, going to community groups, going to environmental justice groups, and asking them, what should we do? Asking experts. And so it really was taking the climate issue seriously and asking yourself, if you really could govern and you really wanted to solve this problem, what would you do? And climate change, as we know, is very complicated. You probably need hundreds of pages of plans to actually do it. And in many ways, it still only scratches the surface to write a 200-page plan on it. But this ended up creating really ambitious targets. So 100% clean electricity by 2035. That was a target that they came out with. The day that came out, I was like, what is this plan? This is way too aggressive. And then I would find myself spending the next 3 years of my life trying to make that a reality. So sort of karma, I suppose, for me, that I criticized it and then had to try to do it. 100% clean new vehicles by 2030, 100% clean new buildings by 2030. These are super ambitious ideas. They'd have to do the building stock turnover to do that is very aggressive. And it was just really exciting. And you can see here, journalists started to cover it. And and it was probably 2019 that the Beto plan came out. I got that wrong, but it was like February 2019, the Beto plan came out. So, this really got excited. I mean, look at this, 144 times this is retweeted. Like, I mean, that's not nothing. Like, this was something that people were talking about and interested in and created a lot of content. Now, you may recall that this man is not president. He is not. He is a governor still to this day. And so what happened was, when they quit the Democratic primary, what they quickly found was that other campaigns wanted to take their ideas, because everybody was loving on this guy. They were like, the climate activists, I mean, not like the normal people who had no idea who he was. He had very low name recognition by the end of his campaign and had like 2% of the vote. So like, but amongst the climate people, he was like, huh. So immediately Warren's campaign adopted a bunch of his plans, and other folks started to basically take on his ideas. And so the campaign, the folks who I talked about, said, well, why would we stop? Why don't we continue to advocate for climate policy? And the campaign was not just for a human being to be president, it was really for climate policy to be enacted. And so what they did is that they founded an organization called Evergreen Action. So the campaign basically stopped being a campaign to elect a single human being. It became a campaign for climate action. And Evergreen, I ended up getting involved with because I was so inspired by these plans that these people had written. And I ended up working with them for years to try to pass these ideas into law. So Biden, of course, you may recall, wasn't doing so great initially in the primary, right? Like, people did not think he was going to win. He had run multiple times for president. The day his climate plan came out, which was, probably a couple of months after the Beto plan, it was panned. And I wrote a very critical thing about it. Somebody quickly realized that there was plagiarism in the climate plan, that there had been parts of it that were lifted from like CCS websites, for example, of like industry associations. And this was particularly newsworthy because when he had run for president before, in I think the 80s, he had actually had to end his campaign because of like a plagiarism accusation. So it was dramatic. And, in fairness, I'm sure he had absolutely nothing to do with somebody copying and pasting an idea from another website. But it wasn't considered a very aggressive plan. It had plagiarism. It was not great. But months later, so this is July, he came up with another plan. Interestingly, I was talking to Jonas about this. I went hiking in the Sierra in July 2020, and it was great. We're in the backcountry, you don't have cell phones or anything like that. And I came out of the pass to my car, and I had all these text messages that were like, why isn't Leah writing a thread about the new Biden plan? Because the campaign had put it out and they wanted me to evaluate it and say that they had improved so much, because they did win the most improved award. They actually adopted many of the plans from Inslee. They adopted the 100% clean electricity by 2035 target. So, this virtuous race to the top eventually influenced the front runner to the campaign. And so I came out of the woods and I sat in my car and wrote this thread about, yay, they did a much better job. Good job, Joe. So, and then the one thing I didn't mention here, which I probably should have, is then when Bernie Sanders became clear that he was not going to win the nomination, there was this sort of unity table that was put together across a wide variety of issues, one of which was climate. And the climate one had people like Gina McCarthy on it, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, current now outgoing executive director of Sunrise, Varshini Prakash, as well as other folks. I think John Kerry was on it as well. Yeah. And these folks sat together and they basically kind of smushed some ideas of different campaigns together and tried to sort of make a more aggressive plan about what Biden would do. So this Democratic primary became a very fertile ground for policy ideas and for really getting climate on the top of the agenda, and created this virtuous race to the top where Biden ended up getting a lot more aggressive on climate by the end of it. And in fairness to President Biden as a human being, everything I have heard from people who work with him directly, like in the White House, is that he actually cares a lot about this issue, that he, cares a lot about young people, that he really this is actually quite important to him, and it's how he views himself. So I think and you see this in some of the moments on the campaign trail. So Sunrise was, for example, bird dogging candidates. And, he got into quite a tense moment with a Sunrise activist at one point, or maybe it wasn't Sunrise, a climate activist. And, I think he felt that his own self-view about what he really cared about, that he really cared about climate, that he was the climate guy, that he had introduced the first bill on climate change in the 80s, because he'd written this kind of like, we should study it bill in the 80s that didn't pass. Oh, did he? No, he did not plagiarize that one. No. So I think his own self-image of who he thought about himself was, not being reflected in what people were receiving of him. So I think he does actually care about the issues personally. Okay, so that's the primary. President Biden wins. And when he wins, what else wins? This is sort of the news story, 100% clean power by 2035. And this is actually an image from my book. I talked to the journalists about this, and they were asking me, like, how can we frame this story to make it interesting? And I said, oh, you can make this narwhal curve that I make in my book. And so they did that. And you can see they show the history of electricity, and they show how aggressive it is. So you can see why when the target came out initially, I was like, that's insane, because it's a very steep upward curve. But hey, so is burning up the planet, also insane. So let's maybe try to do that instead. So he won. He committed to 100% clean power by 2035. He committed to net zero by 2050, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very exciting. So then a bunch of different advocacy groups started to publish reports, and think tanks as well. These are some examples, the ones that I was more involved in, and so I was paying attention to, but they started to say, like, okay, if you want to get to 100% clean electricity by 2035, here's how you do it. And, when we wrote that report in like February, right after the Georgia runoffs, basically, Data for Progress, a polling firm, also put out polling, which showed, like, here's the support for actually doing that. So basically, all these groups started to say, like, here's what you can do, here's how you can do it, and it's popular to do it. Also, Center for American Progress and Rewiring America, which I also work with, put out a plan to, like, electrify the buildings in the country. How are we going to get heat pumps, et cetera? So people started to basically take some of the ideas from the Democratic primary and flesh them out more to the point where they could become part of a legislative package, essentially. And this was some of the work there. And I was talking about this with some of the grad students earlier, but it's really interesting to think about how we got the package that we did. So I was telling people earlier, I don't generally believe in a model of the world that, like, you have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process and that somehow trickles down into what nation states do. I think much more that nation states set the bounds and then it trickles up into the UN process. But here's an example where that isn't the case, where we really saw international agreement and cooperation influencing domestic policy. So people will remember that in the Paris Agreement, small island nations and activists pushed really hard to change the target from Copenhagen of 2 degrees warming as the target to 1.5. It was a really coordinated campaign. A lot of folks from small island nations worked really hard to do this. And so when that happened, they said the global target's 1.5. They then asked the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientific body who, does all the major compiled reports on climate change. They said, will you do a special report to look at that target, the 1.5 degree target? And so they wrote in 2018 a report. And what that report basically said was, here's what you have to do by 2030 if you're going to meet that 1.5 degree target. And that ended up becoming, it came out in 2018, and ended up becoming this narrative about, we have 12 years. People remember this? And it really broke through to the public consciousness, and activists were using that language, including the Sunrise Movement. And it really changed the dialogue in a lot of ways. And it was associated by scientists with a number. So what do you have to do if you want to hit 1.5 degrees? You have to cut carbon pollution by 45% this decade, by 2030. So now we actually have a metric that we can judge ourselves against. So are we going to cut carbon pollution by about half this decade, or are we not going to do that, right? So activists adopted this target, right? Here's the Sunrise sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office, and look at what it says. We have 12 years. What's your plan? This comes directly out of the international process and the scientific work that said, here's what you've got to do by 2030. So then President Biden, when he took office in his first executive order, set a target of cutting carbon pollution by 50 to 52%, basically by about half, hitting that target, right? The 45% target, the 1.5 degree target. He said he would do that by 2030. So here we have this international target that basically gets picked up by activists in the domestic environment that gets pushed into policymaking at the national level in the White House. And the thing you probably don't know is that this was really core to the way that Majority Leader Schumer went about designing this package. So this is a pie graph from a PDF that they put out about halfway through the negotiations. And what they showed was all the different parts of the pie that were going to help us get to a 45% cut, right? See, 45, 45 is the same idea. And there's my defunct program that I helped create, the Clean Electricity Performance Program. It died tragically. And a bunch of other things like clean vehicle incentives, the methane fee, of course, the clean energy tax credits, et cetera. And so they really oriented, and how did they build this model? What they did is that they had a spreadsheet. They called it the ambition tracker. And every time there was a provision that was being discussed, like the Civilian Climate Corps or the Clean Electricity Performance Program or the methane fee or whatever, they would try to estimate using analysis how much it would cut carbon pollution. And so they would have a cost for how much was budgeted and how much it would cut carbon pollution. And as pressure came from Manchin on the negotiations to cut, they were really clear that they had to keep the parts of the package that delivered carbon pollution cuts and that they couldn't sacrifice that stuff. And so, for example, things like the Civilian Climate Corps, which I do support, and I think we're going to have workforce training problems actually, that would have helped with this. That got cut. It was $60 billion. And what is the Greenhouse Gas Association with that? Unclear. Right? The Clean Electricity Performance Program got cut because Manchin didn't like it for other reasons. But when Schumer's team, and also Manchin was part of the reason why the Civilian Climate Corps got cut too, just to be clear. But they were very clear that if they lost big pieces that were delivering big greenhouse gas cuts, like the Clean Electricity Performance Program, they had to find ways to make up for it elsewhere in the package because they had to meet the target. So people would often ask when the final bill package came out and it came out with an analysis of a 40% cut, they're like, how do you still get a 40% cut when it used to get a 45% cut, but you lost the Clean Electricity Performance Program, for example? And in part, it was because they were really, really careful about making sure that they kept programs that were going to lead to pollution cuts. So on the advocacy side, what was happening? So I want to talk sort of about some of the coalition networks that were operating and the strategy within the sort of outside of government world where I was working. So I had this realization during writing my book and afterwards about how do we solve climate change. And I started to realize that it's actually a lot of the solution is two things. Cleaning up the electricity sector, getting to 100% clean power. So that's that 100% clean power by 2035 target, and electrifying everything we can. And if you do those two things, you actually cut 75% of current carbon pollution. I could talk you through that if you're so interested, but basically it's 25% for clean electricity, 25% for transportation, and the last 25% is a mix of building electrification and electrification of parts of heavy industry. So this is a really simple framework, but a very powerful framework because it helps you understand how do we get from this world where everything is spewing out carbon pollution to a world where we're not. And it's clean electricity plus electrification. Of course, it's not 100% of the solution, but it's a really, really big part of it. So with that framework in my head, myself, I thought, okay, I think that we have to coordinate through networks working on electricity and electrification. Because when I had been writing my book and studying all these successful campaigns for renewable portfolio standards and net metering laws, what I noticed is that they were successful because they were working together in these networks. And that when groups were kind of isolated, they weren't able to be as successful as when they were coordinated through a network. And so I thought we need to make a network. So working with Evergreen, we built one network for electricity. It's called the Clean Electricity Group. It still operates. It ended up having hundreds of groups involved in it. And we set up meetings, and I'll talk a bit about what that structure was like. And keep in mind, this was the pandemic too. So it was also this moment where people were really interested in being collaborative online in new ways, right? Because we're all in their houses, so they could do that. And then with Rewiring America, we set up an electrification coalition that also still operates. And, basically I thought, we have to coordinate. Like, we can't just be like, what's Sierra Club think? What does Rewiring America think? What does RMI think? Those were the big groups on electrification at that time, building electrification. We need all those people to sit in a room together weekly and talk about it and figure out how their strategy is and figure out who's talking to what offices and figure out what are we going to do in the media, blah, blah, blah. So we set up these two networks because of my experience doing academic research and seeing that networks were important. So I was just like, hey guys, let's do this. And it's been very successful. And of course, other folks had the same realization and set up different kinds of networks. So years before, in sort of the wake of the failure of the Waxman-Markey bill, there was a big rift within the environmental movement where environmental justice groups felt that they hadn't been incorporated into the Waxman-Markey bill process fairly. And, there's also like the Hamas principles around how we're supposed to have participation throughout the process for EJ groups. And so folks who were very interested in trying to not repeat history set up years ago the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, the EJNCP, which was a new coalition, or a platform, I should say, between EJ groups and big green groups. So Earth Justice was actually extremely central in driving this, as well as, NRDC is part of it and other big green groups. And of course, there are existing environmental justice networks like the Climate Justice Alliance, for example. And there's other kind of coordinating bodies that had already exist, like the Climate Action Campaign, which is a sort of big greens coalition. So some of the existing groups were more focused on the kinds of groups who were getting together as opposed to the subject matter that they were focused on. And so what we did was we set up like subject matter groups that worked on a topic together to sort of push for that. And I think what we saw was folks were working on both inside and outside strategy. So, for example, in the electricity group, we set up subtables. So it was like meeting of the whole, everybody could meet. It was every other week, but then you would go to a working group on the off week, which were Hill work. So there'd be like a spreadsheet for every single member of Congress, every single senator, who's talking to them, what do they think, where are they at, blah, blah, blah. Rather than having, only LCV have that information and have to do that all by themselves, why not share that across a wide variety of groups so that you have more resources as a movement to actually be effective? And so, if somebody has to go talk to Senator Sinema, maybe she's not going to listen to the Sierra Club, but maybe she's more interested in listening to Third Way, for example, right? So how can we strategically as a movement think about who's the best messenger to talk to Manchin, who's the best messenger to talk to Sinema, who's the best messenger to, talk to Sanders, et cetera, right? And coordinate that work. Organizing, which was largely about trying to get folks to, write letters or do calling campaigns or show up for protests or come up with creative things. And of course, and Sunrise Movement was involved in these groups too, and they were doing their own organizing, which was not done in coordination with other groups, but this was part of the work. There was a comms group, which was placing media stories and trying to shape the narrative around things. And, partially, again, the organization of this, which I invented, was because I had read this article by Theda Skocpol. She had done a post-mortem of the Waxman-Markey bill and why it died. And she said, in the thing that stuck with me, which is maybe not the main takeaway from the article, because I've had a conversation, I think, with Paul Pearson, where he's like, well, that's not what I took away from the article. But what I took away from the article was that there was no outside game. And by not having an outside game, that we failed, because EDF had been kind of working by themselves on an insider game, and they didn't really coordinate across the movement, and they also didn't really get the public engaged. So I was always feeling super paranoid that that's how we were going to lose. And the other thing is that, at least I believe, that for the advocates, there was a lot of open policymaking processes. We had a policy design group in the electricity group. People got together, they argued with one another. They said, you need to design it this way, or you need to design it that way. People would share different ideas. There were like rival designs for how to do the clean electricity standard, and they're all workshopped in this group. And so, there was a lot of sharing, as opposed to like, I'm EDF, I'm going to design the cap and trade program with the offices that I'm working with, and, that's that. I'm sure it wasn't perfect and not everybody feels that way, but it was more open than it had been in the past. And partially, I think that's because of Zoom and the sort of network that was enabled by that. Okay, so enactment. How did we get the law? So you may recall the long road to doing this. So President Biden in April 2021 released the American Jobs Plan. I guess it was March 31st technically, but he released the American Jobs Plan. It was a plan. I can't remember how much spending it was, maybe 2 trillion or something like that. And it had a whole bunch of different ideas in it that were taken from the primary and from activist groups, et cetera. Manchin was like, I'm not going to spend that much. And Schumer was very focused on climate the whole time. I remember when he became majority leader after the after the runoffs in Georgia and the 2 Democrats won, he went on Rachel Maddow, like a one-on-one interview. And I watched it. And he said that she asked him, what's your top priority? And he said, climate change. And I was like, yes, because that's what it needs to be, because we will lose otherwise, because we will. So Schumer really cared about this. He has amazing staff. I know his staff very well. They're fabulous human beings who care as much about climate change as I do. And I don't know him personally, but I imagine he cares too. And so he was really, really focused on this. And then, of course, we had Senator Manchin. So some of the outside strategy, this is just some examples of some of the stuff that I worked on. You know, we could talk about like the sunrise marches that they did, the bird dogging of Manchin. There was lots of other groups doing stuff. There was the hunger strike. There was lots of other activities, but there's the ones that I worked on that I could speak to more directly. So with Theta Scotchbowl in my head, I was feeling super paranoid that we were not creating enough pressure on Congress from people. So we created a caller. It was called Call for Climate. We came up with 4 things that people might want. That was really based on the activist demands, like the Civilian Climate Corps, the 40% of funding to frontline groups. That's the Justice 40 thing, the no money for fossil fuels, and the clean electricity standard. And we literally built a caller. We had $0 to do this. I did it with Jamie Henn and Duncan Meisel at Fossil Free Media, who are amazing activists, come out of like 350. And I had gone around to all the sort of like establishment groups and said, like, will you build a caller? Will you build a caller? Like, hey, LCV or Sierra Club. And none of them were asking their members to call Congress. And it was driving me insane, because I was like, what if we lose because we don't have people calling Congress? So we built this caller with no money. I made a video myself in my like living room of me calling Congress using the caller. And then I edited it myself, which I have never done before or since. I'm not a TikTok star. So, and you know, we released it and we ended up getting like 15,000 phone calls to Congress, which is a lot given that we had no money and it was just bunch of random people. And, you know, folks used it on Instagram and TikTok and things like that. And it was really great. In addition, and other groups also mimicked it. So they wanted to use their own caller so they could have their own list, because there's all this stuff about lists. I was like, I don't care about a list. I care about people calling Congress. So other people made their own versions, like Sunrise had a version with some other groups. Some corporate groups felt this was too activisty, so they made a corporate version. I feel like a beauty industry people made one. So it also spawned lookalikes, which is great, because like I do not care. The point was to just get people to call Congress. And then, of course, there was a moment when the National Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy, said that the clean electricity standard that we had been working on so much might die. And Markey went on, and everybody was so upset about it. And so Markey went on TV and he said, no climate, no deal. And in that moment, the folks at Evergreen, who were really talented comms people because they'd worked on the Inslee campaign, they're like comms people on a campaign. They said, that's a great slogan. We got to run a campaign about that. And we got to get everybody to say no climate, no deal, to basically become to become a veto player like Manchin was a veto player. And so they partnered with Sunrise. Well, we partnered with Sunrise, Evergreen and Sunrise, and launched a little micro campaign and got everybody to kind of go on the record to say, like, are you willing to pass a reconciliation package if there's no climate in it? And all these senators and representatives said they wouldn't. They did a press release, an event outside of the Capitol with Markey, who's a wonderful human being. And, you know, folks showed up, and this is the kind of thing that created the pressure and the media narrative that this actually had to be done. And you can see it because other priorities, remember, there was the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. And the American Families Plan had things like home health care aids for people with disabilities, had paid leave for new mothers. Like, I mean, really important stuff that I support. And it didn't happen, you may recall. And, I know the climate movement at the moment that stuff was being cut at the end of 2021 felt like a lot of feelings around, were they screwing over their friends and colleagues at other movements? But we just felt like we are not passing a bill without this. And that kind of hard red line was very important to keeping the pressure up. So in November, Nancy Pelosi passed another climate bill. Remember, she had also passed Waxman and Markey. She did manage to do that. And it was evaluated, this is work by Climate Power, against this target again, against President Biden's target. And they said, are we actually going to meet it or not? And then, of course, it all died. Manchin went on television in December and he said, I don't really want to do this. We all fell into depression. It was a dark time. Then Don't Look Up came out. And for a while, we were like, let's get Leonardo DiCaprio to go to Congress and give testimony, and he wouldn't do that. And then we came up with other half-baked ideas about things we could do, and had a phone call with Senator Markey where he told us that we were going to keep pushing. And I was like, I love this man. And it was a dark, fallow period. And then, all throughout the spring, I still believe we were going to pass it. I remember I went to this workshop at Stanford, and Ezra Klein was there, and he was talking about, the failed Build Back Better. I was like, I'm sorry, why are you saying that it's failed? It's like, well, it's not going to pass. And I was like, no, you can't say that, because it is going to pass, and we're going to pass the climate bill. And I was probably seen as an insane person at the time, that I still believed it, because the media narrative was this is dead. I remember Jeff Stein, who's this Washington Post writer, called me up. It's like, so I'm writing a postmortem on why Build Back Better died. And I'm like, well, you shouldn't write that story because it's not dead. And he's like, really? I'm like, that's a terrible story and it's not true. So I don't think you should write it. And he didn't end up writing it. And months later, I was like, see, I told you, don't write that story. And so everybody thought it was dead. And then in early July, a Schumer friend called me up and he said, I think we're going to do this. I think it's going to happen, but Manchin's making us put bad stuff in the bill. And I'm kind of concerned about how the movement's going to take that. And he wouldn't tell me what any of the bad stuff was, which at the time, as somebody who likes to know everything at all times, was highly annoying. But in hindsight was a great blessing, because people then went on to claim I knew things I really did not know. But, I could guess that he wanted the Mountain Valley Pipeline because I read the newspaper, right? Like, he talked about that all the time. So, folks in the movement started to talk about, like, okay, wow, is this bill going to happen? What might the bad stuff be? How are people going to feel about it? Blah, blah, blah. And then, like a couple weeks later, out of nowhere on a Thursday night, I got a text from Sam Ricketts, who I'd been working with very closely, and he said, the bill's dead. And I said, how do you know, or whatever? Is it true? Right? This news was breaking out of Schumer's office. And he said, Adrian, was Schumer's main climate guy, Adrian's crying. And when I heard Adrian was crying, I started crying, because that was the first time that I really thought we'd lost. Like, we'd gone through depression and dark nights, really, but I was devastated. And, New York Times called me up. I had to give a quote. I talked about how he's condemning his grandchildren. We were furious. And the crazy thing is, somebody like John Podesta, who you may know is now in the White House, like, he's very Democratic establishment. He was saying horrible things about Joe Manchin, which you were like, oh, okay, like the gloves are coming off. And so people in the movement just said horrible things about him, how he was, so you can see a modern day villain. He's killing his grandchildren, et cetera. And that night, I literally just sobbed. I mean, I have young kids, and I had worked all throughout a pregnancy, a very high risk pregnancy. I had sacrificed so much to try to make this happen. And I was just devastated on a personal, planetary, all the levels. But I thought, I can't stop now. I have to write an op-ed about what a horrible human being Joe Manchin is. And so I stayed up till 11 p.m., having been exhausted, wrote an op-ed, sent it to the New York Times the next morning, and they said they would take it, and they ran it on the weekend. And it ran the entire weekend on the front of the New York Times. And Joe Manchin was very clearly on the defensive, because on Friday morning, this was all like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Friday morning, he went on West Virginia Public Radio and he said, no, I still want to do it. I still want to do it. And the editor was like, well, he says he still wants to do it. And I was like, he's a liar and it's dead. And da-da-da. And that weekend was dead. And I got 3,500 hate attack comments that weekend because by trolls who said my children should be taken away from me and like from the right wing, because I think people were worried that it was the fossil fuel industry was worried that this was an effective attack on Manchin, that he would care about his legacy. And anyways, in secret, nobody knew this, but in secret that Monday morning, Senator Manchin went back to Schumer and he said something like, "Are you still mad at me? And are we still friends? And can we still work on the bill?" And so they went to a room in the basement of the Capitol, the Schumer and Manchin teams, and they didn't tell a soul what they were doing. And in this time period, one of my friends was in that room and I was texting him like every couple of days, like, "Hey, I'm hearing that maybe it might still work. What do you think?" And he'd be like, "Oh, everything is lost." And, he would just write me these depressing texts back, bullshitting me basically. And then 10 days later on a Wednesday, I was sitting in my post having meaning and purpose life, reading my children a book for the 50th time because they're very little. And I got a text message at 1:55 California time, which is 4:55 Eastern time, right before the end of the day, basically, with a celebration emoji from my friend in Schumer's office. And I was like, this is the guy who was crying. I was like, well, I just started to swear. I said, "What the fuck is this? I don't understand. What is this? Why would he send me this?" And in front of my infant children, I'm just swearing continuously, very confused. And 2 minutes later, another friend sent me a press release from Manchin's website, which said the Inflation Reduction Act, which caused me, what the hell is the Inflation Reduction Act? Nobody knew what the Inflation Reduction Act was. And so then immediately we went into high gear. We called 25 journalists. We were like, "This is it. We got to do this." Da, 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 da. Which then caused a lot of activists to be really upset because they were like, "How could you say this was the climate bill?" Because they put bad stuff in the bill, right? They put a pipeline permit. Well, they actually put in a separate bill, but they did stuff that people didn't like. And so it became a very dramatic time and I was attacked and then I got COVID and it was bad times, but we passed a law. So that was worth it. If you'd like to know what's in the IRA, I recommend this. It's really hard to know what's in the IRA. So this is a great summary document. And then I'm just going to briefly, before I finish, walk it through. There's clean electricity investments. And interestingly, these are uncapped. So when you hear somebody say that the IRA is $370 billion, that's not true. The IRA is as many billion as we spend for a lot of provisions. So really important money to replace coal plants, actually. Tons of industrial policy, largely uncapped. So the estimate is 60 billion, but it's probably going to be way more to do things like do domestic manufacturing in solar panels, electric vehicles, and batteries, and wind turbines, et cetera. There's consumer-facing incentives. This is what I largely worked on. Sort of things like getting people heat pumps, insulating their homes, getting people EVs. All this is also uncapped, so it's as much as we spend. There's a lot of money for environmental justice. There was very big discussions about exactly how much money for environmental justice because a press release was put out that said it was 60 billion and it probably is not 60 billion because the EJ investments are largely capped because, lower income folks do not have tax liability. So it's not infinite and things were not counted properly. It's true. So, for example, this wonderful analyst, Sylvia Chi from Just Solutions Collective did an analysis in real time where she was like, it's not really 60 billion. She is correct. And there's lots of money for hard to decarbonize sectors like agriculture, heavy industry, et cetera. And then, of course, there's the bad stuff that ended up being a huge part of the narrative, but is honestly a relatively small part of the bill. So basically, there's 45Q, which is a CCS incentive. And then there's some changes to leasing, specifically this requirement that if you leased onshore and offshore parcels for clean energy, offshore wind, onshore wind, et cetera, that you had to also lease for fossil fuels. And they have held 2 leases since that provision happened. And the first one, there was only one bid for $65,000. And the second one, I can't remember how much money it was bid, but it was more than historical. Anyway, we can, if you want to talk about that more. What did I work on and why? I worked on basically electricity and electrification policies. I worked on a big provision that died, causing the Sunrise folks to hunger strike in front of the White House, which was a very tragic time, as well as basically helping people electrify their homes. Okay. what did we learn? Very briefly, Michael Ross, a political scientist from UCLA, says that we learned that economists were wrong and political scientists were right, which I found hilarious, and many other people did too. Just some basic thoughts. So in the public policy literature, we talk about solutions in search of a problem. And so, we defined climate change action as like first, we'll solve the pandemic and the economic problems because it'll employ people. And then when inflation started to happen, right, it will solve inflation. And in fairness, it is good for inflation because like 40% of inflation is driven by fossil fuels. So, basically redefining the issue to the moment. It's really important to build relationships to pass policy, both inside and outside. Legislators really outsource ideas. Like you might have in your head that like, oh, those guys in Congress, they know exactly what they want to do. Like, no, they do not. You can have a lot of impact if you have ideas. I think it's very important that the movement largely coordinated and had very consistent messaging. That was not what happened during Wax and Markey. And that allowed to both set the agenda in the media, as well as sort of like shape public opinion, as well as politicians' perceptions of public opinion, which is something I write about a bunch. In my book, I have this concept of the fog of enactment, which is the idea that you don't really know what's in a bill, what is being passed. I absolutely believe that's true for the Inflation Reduction Act, even to this day. But another thing I didn't know until I was in it is the fight of enactment, just how conflictual it is to actually pass a law. And people who had lived through the Affordable Care Act knew this, because a lot of people got really mad at each other while the ACA was passed, which you don't know probably as an outsider, but people also talked when the Paris Agreement was finalized, everybody was screaming and yelling and treating each other terribly. So it seems like when there's an actual deal on the table and people have to decide which are you for or against, a lot of conflict occurs. And yeah, that definitely happened. So I got attacked. It was very dramatic. It was a hard time. And I had COVID too on top of it. So it was brutal. And the last thing I'll say is we often have this folk theory that businesses are all seeing, capitalist organizations who maximize profit. And my own experience was that they were really narrow-minded and did not see what their interests were and were incapable of seeing the potential upside in change. So for example, the Defense Production Act was something that we helped get Biden to invoke, and we were trying to get domestic manufacturing of heat pumps because there's no domestic manufacturing of heat pumps currently. And we would go to heat pump companies and be like, would you like hundreds of millions of dollars to build heat pumps in America? And they'd be like, no, I don't really think so. That sounds annoying. And would they really give us the money? And you're like, what? So, and similarly, we designed this clean electricity performance program, $150 billion to utilities to clean up the electricity sector. And they're like, it's too hard. We can't do it. And we're like, this is so much money. And in fact, the fact that it was so much money was its downfall because Manchin was like, I don't want to spend that much money giving money to utilities. But they themselves couldn't realize that it would be awesome to have $150 billion. So there you go. All right. Well, thank you so much. Hope that was interesting and happy to take questions.
Is that on? Yeah.
Yes.
That was great. Thank you so much. I've only seen a headline on this, so I don't really know what's going on, but curious to hear your thoughts on other countries' reactions to the IRA.
Yes.
Those sorts of issues.
Yeah, this is super funny. My husband also works on climate policy, and we love to laugh about this one. So, Senator Manchin went from being the villain to the hero. And some of the theories around why that happened was there was another senator who went up to him in that 10-day period I was talking about and said to him, it could be the bottom of the ninth and you hit a home run and then you're the hero and, you could go from being the biggest villain to the biggest hero. And he sort of, I think it was Casey or something like that. Anyway, told him this story. And so Manchin started to think of himself in a different way. And so he went to Davos this year to the European, conversation and thought he would be received because Europe, big green place, be received as the climate guy, the climate king or whatever. And he was and in fairness to Joe Manchin, he really sold the IRA. Once he got to yes, he went on Fox News and talked it up. He did not waver during the endless vote-a-rama, like Kristen Sinema on the other hand. But he was okay, I'm doing this. And he was it is the Inflation Reduction Act and we are doing the right thing. And he really stuck to it. So he went to Davos in that kind of a salesman mode and was look what we did. We're so great. And all these European leaders treated him badly and yelled at him. And we're this is terrible policy because it's industrial policy and I was talking to a European about this the other day. There's a really strong norm in Europe about not putting up like barriers to trade and not investing in one country at the expense of others. And, and this is what this is doing. The Inflation Reduction Act is industrial policy that's like, we will build stuff in America. We will have the full supply chain in America. It's very aggressive in that way. And they're really annoyed by that. And I just find this hilarious because I'm like, well, why don't you just do something? Like if you want to, because, the EU has largely been doing the European Union emissions trading scheme. They have other clean energy targets, et cetera. They've taken the sort of carbon pricing approach to some, alongside other things, but they haven't taken the same industrial policy approach. And now they're mad that America is taking the industrial policy approach. And my attitude is like, well, no one's stopping you. You want to do it too? Go do it. And so that's been some of the kind of reactions. But I do think that we are starting to see a kind of competition happen where other countries are talking about doing it. Like in the UK, if the Labour Party wins the election, I think they're going to want to do lots of stuff on climate change, for example. And I think that the politics, somebody told me that partially the European leaders might be saying this dramatically to kind of rile themselves up so that they can do something about it too, that it's kind of performative internally within internal EU politics. I don't know if that's true or not, but those are some thoughts about some of the international reactions.
Thank you so much for your talk. I hope I didn't scare you by sitting at the front with the sunrise shirt. It was a total accident.
It's all good. I mean, you saw, I'm good friends with Varshini and Evan and Michaela. One of my students has been very involved in Sunrise. So Sunrise is good. I said
Michaela?
many nice things about Sunrise. So.
Michaela is awesome, and thank you for all the nice things you did say about Sunrise. Much appreciated. The question I have is, I'm curious how you view the role of some of the other primaries that played out in the 2020 season, particularly thinking about like Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, Ed Markey, and like how those also potentially contributed or maybe didn't contribute.
That's a great question. That's a great question. I haven't thought about that. So, Justice Democrats, right, is a part of the story that I didn't talk about that I probably should. But the election of AOC she was a Justice Democrat candidate, and I've met many of the Justice Democrats people, and they're very parallel to the Sunrise story in many ways, right? And you can watch a documentary about it, actually, Run the House or something like this, and. They recruited a bunch of candidates. Basically, nobody won except AOC. And she became hugely popular because she's so talented at speaking and she's so brilliant. And of course, she's very committed to activism and movements. And so she agreed to do that Sunrise movement sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office before she had even started the job, which was very strange in historical context and cool and hugely transformative. So I think that was very important. And then, of course, as you talked about, there were other candidates who ended up winning, like Jamal Bowman, who was very focused on like a Green New Deal for schools, for example. And Sunrise got very involved in the primary in Massachusetts. So people don't remember, Ed Markey was being challenged by a Kennedy, and he was like, the Kennedy guy was going to win. Which Kennedy? Can anybody remember? What's the guy's name? Sorry? Joe Kennedy. Okay, one of the Kennedys. Popular name. And Markey was not the front runner at all. He was kind of viewed as like the old guy, sort of out of touch. And the cool thing was that Sunrise put out a video about him that talked about his long career and made him look like a really fancy dude, and also showed up to do door knocking and a lot of work for him. And it was hugely influential in how that primary went because he was not likely to win. And I must say that Ed Markey, of all the people in Congress, not of all, but is one of the people in Congress who was always pushing on this policy happening. He always believed it. I told you that in February of 2022, when it was the dark days, I had this call and Markey asked if we could talk to him. I was like, yeah. And he just talked to us about the Waxman Markey days and how we had to keep believing. And he just kind of gave us all a pep talk about, giving himself a pep talk. It was so great. And so having him in Congress, I think, was hugely important, because if we didn't have someone like that, every seat being slightly different could have really changed the politics, because we already had one Sinema, and it's not clear that Joe Kennedy, he wouldn't have been like Ed Markey was. So yeah, I think that some of those primaries ended up being very influential as well. for other seats. And of course, the Georgia runoffs, right? Like those were hugely influential, and all the activist work that folks like Stacey Abrams did to actually get people to turn out and vote. And, that was hugely important. And I didn't talk about that either.
Thank you for being here. And I bought the book while you were talking. So thanks
Cool.
for the reminder.
It's way less interesting than the talk, but
Talk was pretty interesting. Hey, pick up the previous question a little bit. One takeaway from your talk, which is a little surprising, is maybe the justification of a long primary season and a contest of ideas
yeah.
be having a positive impact as opposed to a negative impact. So that was
Yeah.
a thoughtful takeaway. How administration proof is the IRA? Meaning, how regime change proof is it in terms of its mechanisms and incentives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how robust is it, right? Or like this is what we call retrenchment. Paul Pearson's done a lot of work on this. My book is actually a lot about retrenchment. So if you're into that topic, that is the jam of the book. I feel like most human beings don't know what the word retrenchment means, but me and Paul Pearson do. So yes, will the policy be weakened and rolled back? Great question, big question of my research. I think that part of the logic of the bill is to try to make it sticky. And so a lot of the investments through the 45X program, which is that manufacturing investment, which is done through direct pay, actually, which means you don't have to own tax liabilities. It's unlimited grant money, essentially. It's going into things like battery manufacturing, EVs, wind, solar, all kinds of stuff. And a lot of it's happening in red states. There's been some effort of tracking that. I'm involved in a project to try to do it even more robustly. But I think that's going to start to shift the politics. You're already seeing that in a place like Georgia, where, Georgia's really becoming the EV capital of the country in many ways. And that's a purple state, right? And so if you were to lose a Senate seat there, how would that shift the politics? Like they wouldn't be interested in repealing things like that. But it's such a complex bill that not everything is really sticky. And we've already seen that HR 1, which is the House Republican bill, has included some repeal parts. And it's some of the stuff that I worked on, like the home rebate program. So money for low income folks to like get an electric heat pump or hot water heat pump or an induction stove or rewiring or things like that. So, but that thing about that program is it's a fixed sum of money. It's only $4.5 billion. So that money is going to get spent in like 2-3 years. So the grant money is going to get out the door and not be able to be repealed. Like the Green Bank, $27 billion, that's going to get granted to some institutions. They're going to have the money. The federal government can't take it back. So some of the stuff that they would want to repeal, they won't be able to. And then the tax credits, I think, are going to become quite sticky because there's going to be all these businesses who are profiting off of them. But they could do some sort of like surgical things to screw up certain pieces of it. But that would require the Republicans to have a majority in both houses, be able to cooperate and agree with one another, and have the presidency. So, hopefully that won't happen. And I will say that, just having the presidency is not going to be able to do enough. Now, they could, of course, weaken regulations. And regulations is not something I've talked about today, but a lot of what the Biden administration needs to be doing right now, in addition to implementing the IRA, which is what's currently happening, and it's very complex, is to be doing regulations. And it's hard to do those two things at the same time because there's only so many bureaucrats, and don't forget that Trump hollowed out the federal bureaucracy. So it's a hard time, but I still feel that they're not moving fast enough and they have to do more. So I'm hopeful that it will stick around, most of it, or just get spent and then they can't do anything about it.
So I'm thinking about the tweet that economists were wrong and political scientists were right. And then also just reflecting on kind of the trajectory of your story, starting with cap and trade,
Yeah.
which obviously failed, going to the various clean electricity standards, which ultimately failed, and then success with the IRA. What do you think economists got wrong? And is it more about, in your view, the policy choice of a more or less market-based policy? Or does it have something to do with the political process?
Yeah, I don't think it's about being a market-based policy. I think it's about costs versus benefits, sticks versus carrots. Just the other day, this fancy economist who was in the Biden admin took to Twitter and was like, carbon prices are everywhere and they're such a successful idea and like all hail carbon prices. And then all these political scientists who have written lots of research on how that's not really true were like, excuse me, I did not get involved. I just got tagged into this discussion. I was like, no, I'm not having this discussion. So economists still maintain this view that like if we could just put a price on carbon, everything would be solved. Like prices on carbon have existed since I think 1990 in Finland. You know, something like a third of global carbon pollution, maybe it's more now, is priced. What political scientists show, including Jessica Green, Matto Mildenberger, Barry Rabe, myself, I'm sure Jonas Meckling as well, right? What we show is that the prices are never high enough, and they also exempt a lot of sectors. And why do they do that? Because of political economy. Because is it popular for the oil price to go up? Is that popular? Or did Joe Biden spend a lot of his time trying to get the oil price to go down so that it wouldn't mess up the Democrats getting elected? And a carbon price is about putting energy bills up. So I wrote a piece called The Trouble with Carbon Pricing, if you're interested in reading it, and it walks through this logic. But the point is, when you have something that is correlated with GDP, that is fundamental to people just getting to work, for example, or cooking dinner or anything else, and you then just make it more expensive, and you think you're going to make it more expensive enough that it's going to actually change behavior, because a lot of these things are inelastic, according to economics itself, so they're not going to change their behavior anyway. Wow, that's not going to work. And so basically what political scientists said, you know, as activists were also saying, was like, make it about benefits, you know, give people things. And if you, instead of saying, if you want to drive to work, it's going to cost you more money, say, if you would like to drive to work, here's a cheap EV, costs $1 a gallon to operate, and we're going to take $7,500 off the top. You know, that's a benefits, making it cheaper approach. And then once people have machines that don't run on fossil fuels, then if the price of fossil fuels goes up, it's not as politically important. So you should actually think about doing carbon pricing in time too, to sort of suck out the last drops of carbon from the economy. So this is the arguments that lots of political scientists have been making. I'm sure I've forgotten like 10 of them who've been making it. And so that's what Michael Ross was saying when he wrote that thread.
I actually also have a comment, a question around that slide, which I thought it's really great because I'm a researcher of energy insecurity, and I do go to a lot of conferences, both for the equity folks and folks for the economics folks, and there's definitely a disconnect. And a lot of the economists I speak with, they do not understand why we need to fund home retrofits at all. It is not the most cost-effective way to reduce carbon emissions.
Yes.
And then obviously for all of the EJ people, there's like all of these like historical, you know, reasons and like health reasons and so many other like benefits.
Yes.
And I wonder from your experience, if you can speak a bit to what type of arguments were helpful in making the case for the inclusion of these rebates?
Yeah. Well, electrification of the two things that I talked about that I work on is the happier, easier, more kumbaya side, because EJ groups believe in electrification. We Act, for example, great EJ group based in the Bronx and in New York City. They did this pilot recently where they gave folks, low-income folks, I believe, in a housing project, like induction stoves for free to try it out. And like everybody who got one loved it. And it was like, yeah, it was so great. Like, you know, electrification solves public health issues. You know, it can be in many places more affordable, right? Like it's actually a great thing. And so it's the kind of thing that generally across the movement, with some exceptions around like EVs and lithium and, you know, some edge cases, people can agree with, and we don't have to have discussions about like, well, isn't this technology evil or whatever? Like, so it's an easier, more the movement is, it's easier to agree around electrification. So that's cool. And, you know, the parts of the programs that I worked on were trying to get money for low income folks to transition, because I don't know if folks know the tech program in California, but it's a heat pump rebate program in California, and they just like burn so much money. And just the other day, this advocate was being asked a question about, could you tell us, you know, for the DOE, they're trying to implement these programs, and they were asking about like, well, are the state rebate programs equitable or not? Are they actually going to disadvantaged communities? And they said the tech program probably went 0.5% to disadvantaged communities. So, if you don't target money towards disadvantaged communities, it doesn't go to disadvantaged communities. And then you find things like what Dan Kamen has found in his research with his colleagues, that solar is adopted by rich people. Shocker. Well, that's largely because it's been done through the tax code. So a lot of effort was put into trying to design programs that would be targeted towards more low-income folks. And, I still wish there was more money. I obviously advocated for more money, but that's been a part of it to make sure that everybody has the ability to transition. For a long time, we were talking about the health impacts of things like gas stoves, and we were just like having a conversation by ourselves. I actually gave testimony to Congress in the fall of 2021, and like Ted Cruz is on the committee, and I talked about gas stoves and how they leak even when they're turned off, how they emit carcinogens, how they're super bad for your health, like all the stuff that then had this like public conversation in the last couple months. But we were all having this conversation anyway. So I think public health, but the issue is that it's kind of morphed in the last few months to being around like freedom and whatever culture war stuff. The funny thing is that most gas stoves are in California and New York. And so it's kind of like, whatever, you're not taking away the gas stoves from the Republicans because they generally don't have that many gas stoves. So, so those are some of the narratives. And I think it's been a lot easier to sort of talk about home retrofits. The other thing I'll say is the work of Rewiring America has been super, super powerful. I got involved with working with them. But Saul Griffith, who's one of the co-founders, if you're not familiar with him, he got this, and Sam Kalish, who lives in the Bay Area, who's wonderful. They got this like grant to figure out how many machines there are in the country that like run on fossil fuels. It's kind of like an impossible question, and they decided to do it, and they discovered that there's like 1 billion machines that run on fossil fuels. And so that changes the way you think about the problem in some ways, because, for a long time, we thought about like low hanging fruit and like, let's get rid of super pollutants and let's decarbonize the electricity sector or whatever. But if you also think about all these diffuse small sources, like let's get point sources rather than mobile sources or whatever. If you think about all these, if there's 1 billion small sources, like that's actually quite a big problem, because you need to get every human being to like make a different choice for every single machine that they run that is a fossil fuel machine. And so that analysis by Saul Griffith and Sam Kalish, I think, also changed the dialogue, because it helped people think about all the machines that we actually have to change in the country. Certainly has transformed my thinking. Like, I think every time somebody puts in a new gas furnace, like a fairy dies. That's what I like to say, because it's just like, oh my God, we lost another like 30 years, because that's going to operate for a long time, that infrastructure.
Thank you, Leah, for a fascinating account. Going back to your slide and comments on coalitions and networks. So I'm really curious about how hard it was to bring labor into those coalitions. And you mentioned that business didn't really see its interest. Was labor the same way? Were they at odds with businesses in the same industry?
Yeah. Well, so in addition to skipping over some of these other primaries, I also skipped over. So when Biden became the nominee, they started to set up these working groups. And I know Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker are doing some research on this stuff, but basically they set up like an economics group and blah, blah, blah. And it was a way to kind of bring the experts in the Democratic coalition together to think about policy ideas and sort of create unity. So I got involved in these groups. They were like volunteer groups. They weren't affiliated with the campaign, but you would like hang out and talk about what should we do on economics and what should we do. The first one they made was economics, and then like they made 27 more. And then the last one they made was climate change. And partially they made the last one was climate change because they were making that plan that I talked about. But in those working groups, the IBEW was quite involved. And you may remember that like labor backed Joe Biden a lot. He has good relationships with organized labor. And the IBEW in particular started to view itself as maybe being open to this whole clean energy transition thing, as opposed to in the previous Waxman-Markey days, like in Matt Mildenberger's book, right? Organized labor became a block in many ways to climate action. But so the IBEW started to change. And of course, the United Auto Workers started to shift too, as their employers started to shift and start thinking like, we're going to make EVs. I wouldn't say that's been totally seamless, because there's a lot of concern in the organized labor and car manufacturing about how many man hours per car it takes. I think part of the paradigm shift that needs to happen in both like utilities and companies as well as unions is like the sheer scale of what we have to do. Because like because there's no scarcity, you know what I mean? And like, yes, we need good paying jobs and everything else, but like if you have less human hours per car, but you're making more cars, like, because you have to make so many cars if you actually want to supply the scale that we need. That paradigm shift has to happen. And the other thing is that, you know, building American jobs in this country is a huge part of what the IRA is about. And that is, again, sort of thinking about organized labor and what their interests are. The Blue-Green Alliance was somewhat involved in this. I will say, like, I built some relationships with some folks in the IBEW through these processes, and it was hard around the SEP to get labor folks to kind of get involved and get interested. We tried to think about ways that I think we wrote in like extra incentives for organized labor. And there are those things throughout the bill, right? Like you get extra adders if you do certain things from a labor perspective. So they have been very influential in the White House. When there was a big celebration in September when the bill passed on the White House lawn, and they invited like a bajillion people, labor was on stage with President Biden talking organized labor. So they were very influential within the White House and the way they ended up structuring it. And some of the unions were quite supportive at the end of the day. And I will say one other thing, which is that for Joe Manchin's vote, the mine workers became supportive because they wanted the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund re-upped, and that was part of the bill. Like, you have to remember that this bill was built for Joe Manchin from like day one, right? And so they were constantly putting in things like 48C, which is a program for former energy communities to get extra money to transition. There was just recently guidance that evidently that includes Santa Barbara, so they're going to get extra money too. That's sort of funny. But there's a lot of oil and gas development in Santa Barbara. People forget oil spill. And so things were basically put in there that Joe Manchin should have wanted, and then constituents, including labor constituents in West Virginia, actually did want. And so when he walked away from those things that were put in the bill, like for him and for labor and for his constituents. And that is, I think, partially why he was willing to go back, because there was stuff he actually wanted in the bill and that organized labor wanted in the bill as well.
I think we're running out of time. This was a fascinating account of the IRA. Thanks so much for joining us, adding so much color to it.
Oh, great.